Morning, everybody. We missed last weekend. We were moving our offices, but we're back today. Child support. Good morning, everybody. Hi.
Good morning. Oh, I love how we both showed up with our hands here.
We haven't even seen each other this week.
I know.
This is
I know. It's been crazy. We were moving. It's a lot.
So we missed last weekend because of moving and had a big hearing this week, which was I was thinking this morning about the difference between procedural hearings and fact-based hearings, and was thinking about talking about that next weekend because there really is a huge difference between those types of things, and I tend to like the procedural things and you tend to like the more fact-based things. Which is a nice little partnership because I don't want to go in and argue about the facts, but I like to do the law stuff.
I love the facts. That's the fun part for me. I'm let's do this.
No, you like the fact stuff, and I don't like that. But this week was a procedural thing, and we were successful and won on that this week, which was good.
Yeah.
For our client. And we'll talk more about it on another day, but on a topic that we've talked about a few times. But one of the other things that's going on, in case anybody is curious, a lot of times when I'm what are we going to talk about on Sunday? It comes from something that's been going on in one of our cases because it's just good to make you think about things people may want to talk about. So one of the things that's been going on, although this happens in so many cases with so many people, is the difference between child support arrears and retroactive child support. And they're two completely, totally different things. But sometimes people get them confused or they don't understand the differences between the two things. And there's a really big difference between child support arrears versus retroactive. And people a lot of times use those words interchangeably. In fact, I think people use the word arrears pretty much all the time as though that's just the word we're talking about. But arrears is actually a super specific thing. So break it down.
So when there is a child support order that's already been put in place and those payments are not being made, those are considered arrears, child support arrears. So whether it's, let's say you have a final hearing, whether it's a paternity or a divorce, whatever it is, child support is ordered, and you're not making those payments, you can be held in contempt because you are not paying your child support, and that amount of money, if you haven't paid for 3 months, you're in arrears $5,000, let's say, right? That's what the word arrears is. Now, retroactive support is different. Retroactive support, the statute says that you can go back 24 months from the date of filing a petition in order to ask for back pay in child support, right? So child support that you should have been getting this whole time, but you weren't getting for whatever reason, or you weren't getting the exact amount that the guidelines said you should have been getting, but there is no court order. That's the big difference, right? So let's say there's a paternity case that a dad commences, and it starts today, right? He files his petition today. And let's say he is the person who has not had the child, right? Mom's had the child. So we go back and we calculate child support, and we say, when you don't have the child, you should have been paying mom X amount a month in child support. Now mom is allowed to go back 24 months from the day that you initiated your paternity petition and say, you now owe me X amount of dollars in retroactive child support. It's different because you're not in contempt of an order. You can't get in trouble. There was nothing ordering you to pay child support to begin with. Maybe you were paying it voluntarily. Maybe you were paying the incorrect amount from the guidelines, which you would have no idea because you wouldn't know what the guidelines would say,
maybe
right?
You're paying
so the
nothing.
Or maybe you're paying nothing, right?
Just hanging out, not paying anything.
For whatever the case may be. Now, obviously, you can't, when I say 24 months, you can't go back prior to when the child was born, right? That's ridiculous. We're saying the past 24 months that the child's been alive, you should have been paying X amount pursuant to the guidelines, but the should just means That's what mom should have been getting. So what ends up happening is you then pay that in the future, usually in smaller amounts, right? It's not realistic for anyone to have to shell out
Yeah.
$15,000.
It's
The court just
usually
calculates it.
like that number actually normally is
Correct.
20% of whatever your current guidelines are. So what Now said in the end is like a really
Yeah,
important, it's kind of the critical piece of it here. You cannot get in trouble for not paying something
of
that has
course.
not been ordered. So do you owe it? Perhaps, right? So like child support can be calculated moving forward. That's called prospective child support. And child support can be calculated backwards. That's retroactive child support. But you don't get in trouble for not paying something that hasn't been court ordered. You can only be held in contempt. You can only get in trouble by the court if there was a court order and you just failed to pay it, number one. And number two, your failing to pay it was willful. It wasn't like you just had absolutely no ability to do it. Otherwise, you can't be held in contempt. So, with child support arrears, that is like there's a court order. It tells you pay X number of dollars a month. And for whatever reason, you don't pay X number of dollars a month. Well, now there's child support arrears that are in place. And now you can be held in contempt of court, but not for the retroactive piece of it. And here's the other thing about retroactive, because I can't remember the word that you just used, Naz, but you said something about what the amount should have been. So the thing about retroactive is it gets complicated, and it gets even more complicated with the new statute with a presumption of 50-50, I think, because at this point in time also we're here today on at this day, and now we're looking backwards to see what happened over the last 24 months so that we can calculate what the person should have been paying. But in order to know what they should have been paying, we also have to know what time sharing they've had with the child and whether or not they have been exercising time sharing or have not. And then there's a question that becomes whether that is provable or contested, or whether we're going to include the overnights at all.
I think it's important to know, there's a lot of different factors that obviously go into child support, right? And we've had kind of some prior podcasts, I guess that's what we're
Yeah.
called, prior podcasts on the child support and how things are calculated, right? So there are times where you can end up having to calculate 6 months, right, at a time. Like I had a case where it was like 6 months, mom had a particular job and she was earning this amount of money, dad was earning this amount of money, and during this time, there was no time sharing with dad, right? So you grab that amount and then you get the next 6 months. Well, now dad was having, weekends with the child, but he was making less money. So, you have to take all that into consideration when you're trying to figure out what these 24 months are,
Yeah.
right? Because we take in the income of both parties, and we also include the overnights that they're having with both parents. And once you figure all that out, you have this bulk number, which is your retroactive support. So I think it's
Yeah.
important to know. The other thing I wanted to mention, just because when we say certain things, I know not everyone's like up to speed on this. So when Lisa says the presumption of 50-50 time sharing, we go back to the law that just began July of 2023, where the presumption now, meaning like let's say the default, right? The default is it is in the child's best interest to have 50% time sharing with both parents, right? So that's what she's referring to, because now a lot of parents are actually just starting to do the 50-50 even before we get to court. I mean, I'm seeing that a lot more the past few months is my
Yeah.
clients are saying, well, it's 50-50 and that's what we're doing. So you can go back and calculate the child support, the retroactive at the 50-50 number.
Yeah. You also have to take into consideration that when you are figuring out your retroactive child support, all of the factors, like what Naz just said, all of the factors go into determining child support, whether it's retroactive or prospective. And the factors are health insurance cost for the child as well as for the adult, child care cost, potentially, usually on a retroactive, that is included, the child care cost that you've actually paid. And then also your income or the other person's income, tax status, which I'll touch on in just a second, but your tax status comes into play because we're looking at your net income to calculate child support, but the net income is determined by software, by like pre-programmed factors, because the reality is, if you've ever had a job and filled out your dependency paperwork in the beginning when you're filling out your tax forms, you can claim a variety number of dependents. You can change your tax status and have your employer pay you more or less, or withhold more or less in taxes. Those are things that we can all do. I remember before I had kids, I increased, which was kind of dumb, I don't know what I was doing, but I increased my exemption so that I would have more money taken out of my check, so my refund would be greater, way back in the days when refunds happened. But you don't then get to claim less income because you withheld more in taxes voluntarily. So your tax status does come into play, but it's all done through the formula. So like Naz said, you may have prospectively a set of guidelines that say, today, this is my income today, this is my healthcare cost, the other person's healthcare cost, the child's healthcare cost today. But then you may have had a different number for the last year, and then maybe a different number the year before that, because one of those numbers changed, like either your health insurance or your income or the overnights. The other thing that's really important to understand is this retroactive assessment of child support. This is a court of equity. So the court does have the ability to say, I'm not going to do that with that formula because that wouldn't be fair or reasonable. So if, for example, you as a parent have completely cut the other parent out and have not allowed them to have any access whatsoever to the child, and then you want to claim that you should get an increased amount of child support because the other parent hasn't had any time sharing, well, that's an equitable factor.
So one of the things that I wanted to mention, and I don't recall you saying it off of your like your list on what gets calculated in child support, is any child support that is court ordered to be paid by one of the parents previously, right?
Oh,
So
yeah.
that's important. So let's say hypothetically dad now owes child support on this subsequent child, let's say on a second child, but he has an actual court order ordering him to pay X number of dollars for another child. That amount of money that he's paying in child support is actually deducted from his income. It can't be held against him, right? Because there's a court order saying those, $500, they're not yours. You don't have that in your income. So we're going to take them off the top, and it's not going to be considered as part of your income. Now, everything above and beyond that a parent would pay, because we all know, like, we all pay for more stuff than that, right? But whatever above and beyond that, unfortunately, they don't get credit for it. They only get credit for what is actually court ordered for them to pay. So I think that's important for them to know. It doesn't work in the reverse, right? That's something else that a lot of people get confused about. You then can't go back in your old case and say, well, guess what? Now I'm paying for this other kid, so I want to get credit here too. No, that doesn't work.
I
So
tell
you can
people
only get
all the time, the court
I
basically
know
looks at it like
what you're
this,
saying.
right?
Yeah.
Like, if you had a child and
Yes.
you're obligated to take care of that child, you don't get to have a second child and then take less care of the first one because you had number two.
Yeah.
No, like, in fact, you're going to need to go figure it out so that you can pay
Correct.
for the second
Correct.
kid as
So
well.
it only goes in one direction. It only goes in one direction. Your second child, you can get credit because you have that first child's court ordered child support. You can't go the other way around. So I think that's important for people to understand as well.
And another thing about child support, let me just save you guys like a lot of hassle and time from the get-go. If you're the parent who is paying for health insurance for your children, it's complicated because your health insurance that you pay for yourself comes off the top of your income for when we're calculating what your net income is, right? So we're going to take that off of your gross income that you're paying for yourself. But the portion of health insurance that you pay for the child, that's a different part of the amount. That little section of how much you're paying gets split between the parents based upon their incomes and their percentage of the share of cost of things. So a lot of health insurance companies, when you have health insurance, you just have a family plan. So you just get a bill every month for $500 or whatever it is, and it doesn't break down how much of that's for you or how much of that's for the child. So in pretty much any family law case, if you are the person paying for health insurance, you need to reach out to your insurance provider and say, hey, I need a breakdown of how much this policy would cost just for me versus how much is this policy going to cost for me with the children, so we can figure out the math on that, because the portion that's for the children gets shared between the parents, but the portion that's for you does not get shared. So you can save yourself that hassle as well. But that's another one of those things that when we're looking at retroactive child support, it isn't just as easy as saying, oh, well, prospectively, the child support's $1,500 a month, so therefore, for the last 24 months, it should have been $1,500. It doesn't work that way, because if any of those factors changed over that 24-month period, then you have to redo it for that section of time.
Yeah. The only other point that I wanted to make about all this is that when we are in court and we're calculating all of this, right? Usually when you go to a temporary child support hearing, the only thing you're really trying to figure out is prospective child support. In other words, child support moving forward.
Yeah.
Because
Because it's an
obviously
emergency. It's
it's
like
an
a
emergency. Like,
temporary
you need money.
Band-Aid.
Yeah, it's important. We get into court. You need money. You need money to survive for the next few months. But the calculation of things like retroactive support, and it's also the same, it's true for like attorney's fees, right? So those are things that usually a court at the end of the case will assess, right? So at the end of the case, because there may be where there are instances where one parent owes, but then the other parent owes for something different, right? So there has to be like an ultimate calculation. We can't calculate retroactive in the middle of a case and then other things happen and then we have to recalculate and change the number. Like, it just doesn't make sense. So usually when you go into court for child support, you go in there, you have a temporary child support for prospective child support, meaning child support moving forward. And then when you go to court on your final hearing, or ultimately you have an agreement at mediation, that's when you sit down and you calculate all of these things, right?
Yeah.
Whether there's retroactive, whether there's arrears, now because there was a temporary child support or you didn't pay. Like, there's all these calculations that have to happen. And included in that is also attorney's fees. So you can kind of figure out at the end of the day, what is owed by which party. And then we're not going to have like, you pay this, I pay that. It's obviously like a calculation, like, you owe me this in fees, you owe me this in child support, have a final number, and then figure out how it's going to get paid. So it just makes things easier. It's just a smarter approach on doing that.
Yeah, well, and also I think a lot of time, temporary hearings, like a temporary child support hearing, we schedule them quickly, early in the case. We don't necessarily have all of the facts. It really is sort of like a Band-Aid, and we're trying to get something in place so that there's not nothing in place. But we don't have all of the data and evidence to figure out an entire 24-month period prior to somebody filing at a temporary relief hearing always. So, but the child, figuring out the prospective child support is important, because you do have to understand that if you are the person who owes child support every month, that child support is adding up.
Yeah.
It's not like there's a 24-month maximum on things. It's 24 months backwards prior to the date of filing. So if it takes us 2 years to get through a case, then you could end up with 48 months worth of support. And a court is not going to want someone to go 48 months without paying, which is why they give these temporary relief hearings, so that there's something in place. But it doesn't mean that it's the permanent number or the perfect number, because we don't always have all the information at that point.
Yeah, and I think it's important, because of what Lisa just said, that if you are the parent who doesn't have the majority time sharing with the child, or maybe any overnights, you make some amount of payments, right? Whatever you can, even if it's in smaller amounts. And then obviously keep track of those payments, right? Don't hand the other parent cash. And nowadays we have a lot of things that we can do, like we can Zelle, right? It doesn't have to be like you pay through a certain way. We have all these other methods, right? Zelle, Cash App, Venmo, whatever. All of those, you can download those statements. You can prove that you have paid X amount to this parent, as long as it's clear that it's to the other parent, right?
I actually I tell people, if you don't use Venmo or Zelle or Cash App or one of those things, open an account and only use it just to pay the support.
Yeah.
Like, if you don't do anything else with it, have a Venmo account and just only send your support through Venmo. It actually makes it easy, because then I know every single transaction on Venmo is going to show what you paid the other person. It's just a cheap, easy way to do it.
Yeah. But it's important to make sure that you are paying something, right? Because then at the end of the day, the amount that you owe in retroactive is going to be that much smaller. The other thing that I wanted to point out is anything above that is paid for like child support. Like let's say that there's a child support order for $400 a month, but you pay more than that, you have to assume that that's not anything that that's going to be considered a gift,
Right.
right? So that's important for you to understand. Like, it's not like you prepaid your child support for the following month,
Right.
right? People are like, well, I paid this, so I should get credit the next month. That's not the way the law
No.
sees it. So the law sees it as though you pay X amount every single month, unless things happen, right? There's always but it could be something else,
Yeah.
right? Like if you have a written agreement, something you can prove in court. But it's important for you to understand that if you're paying above that, the law is going to consider it a gift, which means you're not going to get credit for it. It's going to be like, well, thanks for the extra money this month, right? So that's also important.
So, and along those lines, let's talk about this other factor, right, of why you would not necessarily want to calculate retroactive at a temporary relief hearing, is that the other piece of it is the person who owes money also has the opportunity to show that during that 24-month period, any payments that they made of necessities of the child during that 24-month period can be credited towards their child support obligation. So that's not true of everything, right? Like if you went to, I was about to say Toys R Us, there is no Toys R Us anymore, but when there was a Toys R Us, if you had gone to Toys R Us and spent $200, you're not getting credit for $200 at Toys R Us. But if you have purchased school supplies, if you have paid medical expenses, if you have
diapers, wipes,
yeah,
formula,
right, food,
yeah,
groceries, any kind of necessity, we at that point is lives at Macy's. Oh, that is
it
true.
is
Actually, I
true.
just
It is there.
discovered
Thank
that
you. Thank you for all the important
yeah,
information.
that they
That's my
now
husband.
have. It says lives. I said lives, but it does live at Macy's. I was excited about that when I saw it. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, so like anything that you have purchased that's a necessity for the child and you can prove it, then that also can get credited. So not only are there like all of these moving periods of times with different factors, and we have the time sharing element, but we also have the element of what has this person paid and what are they going to be able to prove that they paid. So there's just so many different factors that go into the retroactive piece of it. And quite frankly, 95% of our cases settle on all of these
Of
issues
course.
because child support is just not that complicated.
Yes.
Once we know the numbers, the only cases where it gets overly complicated is where people are like self-employed or have difficult income calculations. But other than that, most of the time this stuff settles because it's really just math.
Yeah.
But not always. Sometimes you have to have a hearing
On
and
silly things.
then you do what you have to do.
Yep.
All right, ladies and gentlemen. Well, thanks for tuning in this Sunday.
Bye, everyone.